And to lead us in this discussion in this conference room, we have John Thornhill, who has been deputy editor at the Financial Times since 2012. In January 2016, he was appointed as the Financial Times' first innovation editor, something he's creating on his own. In fact, he's innovating this new position at the Financial Times. From 2009 to 2012, he was the Financial Times' news editor, based in London on the main news desk. Prior to this, he spent many years in Paris and other cities as editor of the European edition of the Financial Times. He's also been the Moscow bureau chief, the World News editor, the Paris bureau chief. Please join me in welcoming John Thornhill.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be here. Really fascinating subject at an amazingly interesting time. So it's a perfectly timed debate. Now, I've heard that you Swiss people are very interested in very pragmatic people. And we've heard a lot about the theory of basic income this morning, but we're going to really focus on how it might work. And to that end, we've got 4 great speakers on the subject today. Starting from my left, we have Michael Faye, who is the co-founder and executive chairman of GiveDirectly, which is a really interesting initiative aimed at alleviating extreme poverty that I'm very keen to hear more about. We then have Amira Jehia, who is the managing director of the German initiative Mein Grundeinkommen, and she raises money to give people a basic income of 1,000 euros a month for a year, which sounds fascinating. We then have Ville-Veikko Pulkka, who is a social policy researcher at the Social Insurance Institution of Finland. And as you know, Finland is itself conducting some experiments with basic income. And finally, we have Guy Standing, who is a professor of economic security. He has had a long time interest in this subject and is the co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network. So we've got a great panel, different perspectives, different nationalities, different experiences. We're slightly compressed for time now, so I'm going to get straight on with it and ask Michael to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. So good morning to those of us on East Coast time and are just waking up. I have to say it's hard enough to follow Rob Johnson, but Prince and David Bowie is a whole nother level. So bear with me. We're going to spend some time on the evidence. So what I'd like to talk about is the role of evidence in being a catalyst for a movement and policy change, but also being a necessity and a buttress. And what I'll talk about specifically is the role and the story of GiveDirectly over the last 8 years. So very quickly, GiveDirectly is a nonprofit that I co-founded. It has 2 missions. The first is to give as much cash or capital to the extreme poor as possible. That involves both raising funds and delivering it as efficiently as possible. The bigger mission of GiveDirectly comes from the recognition that even though we have raised over $100 million, we are just a small drop in the bucket relative to the hundreds of billions of social spend on development programs and domestic programs. So the question is, how can we use our capital and what we are doing to actually impact the broader policy discussion? And what we've been pushing is this idea that not that everything should be cash transfers or direct giving, but that cash transfers can actually be a benchmark for social spend. We can force policymakers, interventions, organizations to ask the question of whether they are doing more good with a dollar than the poor could themselves. And the counterfactual I often put out there is imagine a world where that capital and cash was already sitting with the poor, and ask yourselves for every social program, would I feel comfortable taking that money back and saying, well, don't worry, we'll provide you training programs, we'll provide you food stamps, and so on. So this is what we do at GiveDirectly. We've raised about 105 million, reached about 34,000 households or 170,000 people, and gotten about 91% of the money to the extreme poor. Now let's flash back a few years to when GiveDirectly was getting started. And we launched publicly in 2011 and had been working on it for a few years prior. So this was the headline that the New York Times Magazine decided to cover us with. Is it nuts to give the poor cash without strings attached? This was one of many. We were called crazy. The head of a very prominent foundation asked us if we were smoking crack. And this really was the rhetoric at the time. Cash was crazy. It was on the fringes, and we all knew that if you gave a man a fish, you would feed him for a day. We made policy by aphorism. Hopefully, this starts to sound familiar to where we are today in many of the conversations around universal basic income. So what happened next? So what this chart is a map of all of the randomized control evaluations of cash transfers. Randomized control evaluations are the gold standard for evaluations, and you can see there are quite a few. This map was pretty much covered between 2006, the late 2000s, and today. In other words, there really was a revolution of evidence around cash transfers. A couple of points about the map. One is, as you can see, this is not one paper, this is not one study, and it is not one country. There is global evidence that cash transfers and direct giving are effective. Conversely, there is no evidence that cash transfers lead people to stop working or to become alcoholics. The second thing I'd point out is that if you look, the impacts of cash are as heterogeneous as people themselves. If there is one lesson, it is that every individual has different unique needs that are very different to predict from Zurich or New York or DC. And the last thing I would say, which is often the most surprising, is that one-time cash transfers can actually have long-term impacts on people's income and social welfare. Now, to preview a bit of where we're headed, the one thing that is not on this chart is that we do not have many studies on the short-term or long-term impacts of long-term cash transfers. What does it mean to give somebody cash for a lifetime or even 10 years? None of these studies address that. So we had the evidence revolution. One piece of it, and I feel obligated to show this when your friends ask you about all the poor drinking and not working. And I always say, next time someone asks you that, tell them, I gave cash to my family for Christmas or a gift certificate. If you asked me if my mother drank the money away, that would be a really offensive question. And yet, it's not offensive when we ask it about the poor. The study on the left is by Abhijit Banerjee and colleagues at MIT. The heading is Debunking the Stereotype of the Lazy Welfare Recipient. It's a wonderful paper. It looks at all the evidence. There's no evidence that the poor stop working. And on the right is a study by the World Bank, which is also a literature review, which shows not only is there no evidence that the cash drink and spend it on drugs, but the evidence actually points the other way, that spending on these types of vices goes down. So what happened with all this evidence? So what happened is we went from a world where cash was crazy to a world where we are now debating the implications of cash transfers on the UN system and the structure of UN agencies. What does the World Food Program look like in a world of cash? Do we need to structure the sector according to silos, shelter, food, health, and so on? Just to give you a sense of where the debate has moved in development, Ban Ki-moon recently said, cash-based programming should be the preferred and default method of support. Now, that's pretty profound for someone running an organization structured around sectoral silos. DFID asked the question, why not cash? And if not now, when? The European Union asked, why not cash? And even the UK, the most recent UK Conservative Party manifesto has a clause that says, we will help people of the UK give money directly to individuals and entrepreneurs around the world. Now, I would posit that this shift from crazy to these kinds of conversations, which are the beginning and are happening at a high level, was the result of the evidence that was created on the previous page. So the world of cash in development has moved from the fringes to mainstream. Opened the paper a few weeks ago. GiveDirectly recently announced what we're doing on universal basic income, and I felt like I was having deja vu. What would happen if we just gave poor people money? And Vox's more radical take was a charity's radical experiment. The conversation around basic income reminds me of where the conversation was around cash 7-8 years ago. So what are we doing about that? And I think we do see the parallels, and I think it is going to be a combination of everything that people in this room are doing, the evidence, or really nuanced, strategic media effort around it. And what we are doing to help with that broad push that we're all making is we just announced what I think is the first full universal basic income in terms of 3 dimensions. One is that it's truly universal. So this will not be targeted to a subset of people. It will not be a negative income tax. Every individual within villages that are selected will receive cash. And we're looking at about 50 villages in East Africa. The second, that this will be a full basic amount of money. So the range will be about 75 cents to $1.10, which reflects on the left side the food poverty index, and on the right, the absolute poverty level in these regions. The most exciting thing to me is that it will be long-term. So assuming we raise the full funding, this will be a 15-year distribution of cash. Now, that does not mean that we need to wait 15 years to get results. One of the most interesting things to me about long-term transfers is, what is the short-term impact? Do people start looking for different jobs? Do people go back to school? Do they take their kids off the fields and put them in school? And so on. And it will be randomized. So this will be led by Abhijit Banerjee at MIT. Just to let you know where we are, so we're pledging 10 million of our own capital from GiveDirectly. We're looking to raise 30. We're at about 12.5. And just to give you a sense of the scale, this is about $50,000 per year per village to get this done. So I think one of the exciting things about doing it in East Africa is that we could, for 30 million, which is pretty reasonable relative to global social spend, do a pretty meaningful experiment. I won't go through this. This is a sense of some of the questions that we're trying to ask. I hope people grab either me or Joe Houston, who's also from GiveDirectly, here to talk about what questions do you want answered. As you're thinking about policy around the world, what are the key questions to answer around basic income? And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's a great way of setting up the debate. Now, Amira, you're another of these crazy people who believes in giving cash directly. Can you tell us about your experience in Berlin?
Yeah, well, we started a basic income project, which is really low-key in comparison to what you're doing. We basically crowdfund money via different tools, by really small donations we get from various people in Germany and other German-speaking countries. And then whenever we reach the full amount of 12,000 euros, which covers a year-long basic income in Germany, we raffle it out to someone who subscribed to our raffle on the webpage. And by now we have, I think it's 36 people in Germany that are receiving a basic income. Some of them have already gone through their year. And we're basically collecting their stories, and we're giving them to the press, like linking them to the press and trying to get their stories out to Germany, because the debate more or less evolves around the question whether people would stop working or not stop working. And that's like the main focus in Germany, besides the financial question. So we're trying to just show people what people would actually do if they had basic income. And it works pretty well so far.
Yeah. And can you just tell us a bit about, I know it's very early days, but what are the conclusions from that? Do people stop working? Do they spend it all on drink? What do they do?
Yeah, but basically what we expected would happen from those 36 people, only one is actually using the money for luxurious goods, to do holidays, to buy stuff, to just have a better life. And most of them actually changed their jobs because they were really dissatisfied with their living conditions and their situation beforehand. Or they're supporting their families, or spending more time to raise their children, spend time with their children. Basically everything that most of the people who are for a basic income expect actually did happen in Germany so far.
Okay. Right. I'm very interested by this debate because it's, I think, one of the big objections to basic income is that everyone else would stop working if they were to receive it. So could I just ask for a show of hands in the room? If people in Switzerland were given a basic income, how many people here think that other people would stop working as a result of that? Okay, not that many. And how many people themselves would stop working if they were given a basic income? As far as I can see, only 2 people. So that either suggests you're an incredibly hard-working audience, or that this thesis is not necessarily borne out by the evidence. Ville-Veikko, could you tell us about what is going on in Finland?
Yes, our new government center right-wing coalition government is now supporting this kind of evidence-based policies in Finland, and the basic income experiment is one initiative they have made. Actually, the idea of basic income has been discussed since the 1970s in Finland, but it's fair to know that before this reference was made to a basic income experiment in the governmental program, it was not considered as a serious policy. So we started, Kela, my employer, is leading the research project, and we started the project last autumn. We published our preliminary study on 30th March. We made some recommendations, then there was again a policy process, and then now we are continuing our work. What we recommend for our government is to have nationwide randomization. We need at least 10,000 people if we want to have statistically significant results when employment changes 2 percentage points. We are also recommending that this could be combined with more intensive regional samples. And what we are also recommending is that we don't want to dilute the level of the current social security. So we don't see that the level of basic income should be lower than the current basic security benefits. Our model, what we recommend for the test, or for the experiment, is so-called partial basic income, so earnings-related benefits, additional social assistance, and what else? Anyway, at least these 2 would be left intact. So it wouldn't be a so-called full basic income that would replace all the social security. As you may know, the Finnish Nordic system is quite extensive in the sense of social security, so we have quite good social security already, and also quite many free or quasi-free public services. I have called this experiment the Actuation Policy 2.0, which refers to the fact that our government actually wants to still emphasize labor supply. They want to see what happens. Do people participate in labor markets more, or do they increase their workload? I think also, Guy, we disagree with this target. We are not sure that if it's worth the experiment, but I usually answer this critic that I'm just working here.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. Now, Guy, you have been studying the subject for a long time. Can you tell us about what your conclusions are on this?
I have a strange feeling being here. Having worked on basic income for 30 years, we set up the Basic Income Earth Network in 1986 with philosophers, economists. Some Nobel Prize winners have joined over the years. We have networks in over 30 countries, and we've done a huge amount of theoretical and applied research in that period. And I'm really fascinated to see that today, suddenly there is a huge respectability about the subject. For many years, and I was working in the United Nations, we literally were regarded as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And gradually, we've seen a conversion to mainstream thinking, and we've had 15 international congresses, we've had presidents, prime ministers come to that, and it's gradually changing the debate. So I really salute the basic income movement in Switzerland. I was an inaugural member of Bien Suisse in 2002, and I really hope that success comes from this referendum. We don't expect to win, okay? We expect respectability, because now it's on the agenda, as it was said earlier. Now, I read recently in the New York Magazine that the first basic income pilot is about to be launched. Well, having worked on them for 12 years, you can imagine that I had mixed feelings about this first, okay? I think there are 3 approaches to basic income. First, you can approach it from a philosophical point of view, as a matter of social justice. Now, that tradition goes back to Tom Paine, William Morris, G.D.H. Cole. There's a rich tradition. My own teacher, James Mead at Cambridge, they had that philosophical approach. The second approach is what I've been using in my books recently on the precariat, which is to say that globalization and the technological changes that we're seeing taking place and the insecurities that are coming has induced a new class fragmentation. And you cannot have a debate about basic income and the relevance of it in 2016 without thinking of the class dimensions and the class dimensions of inequality, and in particular the growth of the precariat. The precariat, you will find, is the group facing unstable labor, lack of occupational identity, lack of a sense of career, lack of entitlement to benefits, and losing rights, all form of rights, who are most receptive to the debate on basic income. That's why new political parties across Europe, like Podemos, like Syriza, like various other parties, like Alternative in Denmark, the Greens, are embracing basic income. It's part of a new progressive thinking. But I warned in my 2011 book, The New Dangerous Class is also listening to the sirens of fascism, neo-fascist populists. And I warned of days of rage and the fact that there will be this political extremism unless we do something quite radical to provide people with basic security. The latest incarnation of this is Donald Trump. Next year we'll have Marine Le Pen. I've just come from Budapest where Orban is striding the country. These characters are a real threat. So you can also advance a cause for basic income by arguing that politically it's now an imperative to move somewhere in this direction. And the third dimension is that basic income is part of the development tools that we should be using. Michael has just mentioned some of those. And I think it's remarkable that in our pilots, and we've got a book on our pilots in India, where we provided over 6,000 people over several years with a guaranteed basic income as a right. Unconditional, cash, paid monthly, universal. And there's an important point in universality. You don't go for selectivity and means testing. If you only target the poor, you will do what Richard Titmuss warned us against. Policies that are only for the poor are invariably poor policies. You get away with your poverty trap, you do away with precarity traps that I've talked about, and you can provide basic income. Now, I have a few copies of the books if you're interested, but there are also some videos that we've made that are very emotional. And I want to end my opening remarks, as it were, by just telling you the summary of the results from our pilots in India. We've done 3. And our pilots in Africa. We've been involved in 2. But also pilots that have been done by psychologists and the famous one, Dauphin, in Canada. We found the welfare effects of a basic income, and we've done a randomized controlled trial variant, because you can't go a randomista way with a social policy as you can with a medical thing. We found the welfare effects are fantastic. Improvements in nutrition for the children, improving health, sanitation, collective action to improve the sanitation of villages, better schooling, better attendance, but also the equity effects. If you provide everybody with a universal basic income, the people who gain more, relatively, are women, the disabled. That's why we've got a picture of a disabled woman on the front cover. The scheduled castes benefited more than others. There's also a third round of effects. Contrary to what a lot of people allege, without evidence, people who have basic security usually work more, not less. And when they work, they're more productive, not less. Good experiments by psychologists as well as our empirical studies have shown that. In every village where we have done the basic income experiments, the amount of work and labor went up. The only group for which it went down, we're very sad about that, is children. Well, we can't get everything. They were going to school, okay? So the economic effects have been quite strong. Production has increased. Incomes have gone up, discounting the effects of the basic income. Women's involvement in the economy has increased everywhere. But the fourth effect, on which I would like to end, is actually what has been probably most surprising, but also the most rewarding for anyone who favors basic income. The emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value. It enables people to have a sense of freedom and face the constraints holding them back in their living. And a unique aspect of our experiments in Madhya Pradesh, which I didn't think we were going to get, but I was very pleased we did, is that I've always argued that there are two meta-securities. And one meta-security is basic income security, and the other meta-security is voice. Unless you have collective voice, as well as individual voice, you're always going to remain vulnerable to the bastards who will take it away. So what we did is we chose half the villages where there was a collective organization representing people, and half without. And we made comparisons over time. And the results are very good. But funnily enough, the results that were positive for voice were the economic aspects, whereas the welfare effects didn't seem to matter so much. So voice does matter. I think we're at a wonderful stage when suddenly basic income pilots are the next phase. There's a famous statement made by Milton Friedman, who said that ideas take approximately 30 years to germinate and become the inevitable. We're nearly at 30 years in Bien, but this stage of pilots is going to legitimize it. The Finnish one, and I'm glad the Prime Minister is supporting it, and I'm going back and forth with Finland, and I hope to continue to do so, is also matched by the Netherlands. 20 cities in the Netherlands. It's matched by Ontario. The Scottish nationalists want to do it. Various other countries are moving in this direction. So we're at a very exciting phase, and I hope that the Swiss referendum leads to new developments in Switzerland as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. Now, I'm just going to throw one question at you all, and then I really want to open it up to debate from the floor. My colleague at the Financial Times, Tim Harford, who is quite a respected economist in his own right, wrote a recent article on basic income, and he said that one of the problems with it is that the welfare state would either be a lot less generous or a lot more expensive. And I quote him, "In the end, the idea of basic income appeals to three types of people. Those who are comfortable with a dramatic increase in the size of the state, those who are willing to see needy people lose large sums relative to the status quo, and those who can't add up." Now, I'll ignore the third category because I assume that you're all numerate on this panel, but which of those categories would you fall into? Michael?
I certainly hope it's not the third, having done economics for a fair bit. So I think it's more nuanced than the media portrays, which often happens. And it really depends on the country you're talking about. We did just the most simple math of how much would this cost by country as a fraction of GDP and as a fraction of current revenue. And If you look at the US, it looks very expensive compared to current revenue. If you look at the Scandinavian countries or resource-rich countries like in Namibia, it starts to look much more reasonable. What I think that means there are going to be places where there are trade-offs. We may need to not give a full basic income. We may not be able to give it for a lifetime. How do those trade-offs actually affect the impact of the basic income? Those are questions that we have some, but not a lot of answers to. And they're questions that I hope with the pilots that everyone on this stage is doing, we can get some more answers to.
Okay, Amira?
Can you repeat the first one? Because I didn't really understand it.
So the idea is that you either have to be comfortable with the idea of a large expansion of the state, or willing to see needy people who at the moment benefit from the welfare state losing some of the privileges which they have at the moment.
Yeah, do they really have privileges? I mean, I think that's really open to debate, because if you talk to a lot of people who are living on benefits, at least in Germany, I don't really see that they're privileged. It's really hard for them to find a job, because if you get money from the state, thank you. If you get money from the state and you go to a job interview, then you have that stamp on your CV that says, oh, that person hasn't been working for a few years or a few months, so why would he be productive for our company or for the job that we're looking to hire someone for? And so I'm really against that argument, actually, and I think it's a really necessary step for everything that's going on in the world with globalization, technologies coming forward. It's just really necessary, because we will not be able to have enough jobs for everyone in society, and we cannot exclude people who do not have the chance of getting a job.
Okay, Ville-Veikko.
Yeah, well, currently basic income is for me just an empirical question, and I better answer that question in 2 years. But you know, like if I had some political views, I'm an objective researcher, so I don't have any, of course. But I think like a technological change is kind of context that no one can ignore, and I think if we just forget how people are behaving or other this kind of individual behavior issues, we would get much more interesting discussion about basic income. And I think especially this event today and this context that is linked to basic income, I think it's the most fruity that can be in this issue.
Okay, thank you. Guy?
Well, I suppose that's why Tim is a journalist. Because his three options are straw man stuff. Imagine you're Mario Draghi, president of the European Central Bank. You've just got unelected appointment, and you have the chance to hand out to the Eurozone 1,000 billion euro. He gives it to the banks, to the financial community, who then invest it in Chinese equities and so on. And there's no growth in Europe. Income inequality has worsened, the research shows it. Deflation has continued. But supposing part of that money, just part of that money, had been used to give a basic income to the poorest regions of the European community. Tim Hartford, what do you say about that? Put my questions back to him. We could afford something like that. It's called quantitative easing for real people. Okay, instead of a basic income from bankers, I nearly used another word, we should have a basic income for everyone. But I've also proposed that we use sovereign wealth funds. Now, the Alaska Permanent Fund is an embryonic form of providing a basic income. When they introduced it, Alaska had the highest poverty rate in the United States and the highest Gini coefficient of inequality. Today, largely because of the fund, it has the lowest poverty rate of the US in any US state and the lowest Gini coefficient of any US state. They're right. So you can do it. The Norwegians had the common sense to set up their sovereign wealth fund with North Sea oil. Britain, Tim Hartford's country, privatized it, and it's now run by the Chinese state enterprises, North Sea oil. So there are many ways of funding it. And it's just ridiculous to think that you've got to increase marginal direct taxes and that's got to bear the weight. There are other ways. Get rid of the subsidies that go to corporations and the rich. Let's be really serious about this and not in his flippant way in his journalistic pieces. Excuse me.
Right. I shall relay your remarks to Tim. Now, questions from the floor. Who would like to pose some questions? Gentleman here. Could you wait for the microphone to arrive, please? And could you say who you would like to answer the question?
Anyone on the panel? Niklas Anzinger from Dahlia Research. My question is, what do you think could be, or what do you say about the argument that right now we have a lot of economic nationalism and basic income? What would the answer be of a good basic income to fears of, oh, greedy foreigners are coming to my country, we have to make our state more exclusive and things like that?
All right.
Surely we have been also studying the legal preconditions of basic income, and we are actually already living in a system that if you're a European Union citizen and you come to Finland, you have the same rights. Okay, we are now in Switzerland, so it's a slightly different case, but still, it's politically big question nowadays. But in reality, the difference would not be that big.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The lady over there.
Well, so far we talked a lot about what basic income would do to the individual, and I'm wondering what it would do to the economy. So maybe the people who had practical experience could tell me. Usually in economic models, if you raise the income of people, this would also be or end up into a raising of the price levels. So, I mean, what's the experience on this side of the medal? Do you have like any data on what systemic consequences basic income has? I mean, like for instance, watch Zurich. Like if you have wealthy people, you have also big prices, and I'm kind of afraid of this wouldn't really have big impact on what happens in the long distance.
Okay, Michael.
Give a quick answer. So we've looked at this with pretty big grants to individuals in East Africa. And what you saw was that there is a very quick price increase, which is very quickly thereafter compensated as supply adjusts and prices tend to fall. There's not nearly enough research on this question and the general equilibrium effects. We're doing, outside of this project, a much bigger project on precisely this question. Guy may disagree, but I do think it's a very much an open question. I don't think we've seen inflation in a lot of the cash programs we've seen, but we've also never looked at the levels that we've been talking about.
Okay, Guy?
On the first thing about migrants, on a practical point of view, the basic income is not a panacea. We always emphasize that, and we should do so today. You cannot, the famous analogy, you can't play golf with just one club, right? And I don't think you can solve the migration crisis that's hitting all of our societies with a basic income. But a basic income you can use as a sensible tool of social policy for your citizens and your legal residents. And say to migrants, look, you have to wait for a qualifying period. That doesn't mean you don't give assistance to migrants and refugees. Of course we should, but treat that as a separate issue. On the economic effects, as our book and the studies have shown, you want, as an economist, you want to have two handles in your scissors. And just because you put in money to a community doesn't necessarily mean the prices are going up. Milton Friedman wrote a paper about that many, many years ago, helicopter money. Because actually what happens is the elasticity of supply of basic goods and services, particularly in low-income communities, is very strong. So what we actually found in all the villages in India was that the unit prices of things like wheat and rice and various basic goods and services, clothes and things, went down. The same we found in Namibia over the 2 years, because the supply had increased. And a lot of people were taking up secondary work and third amount of work, which tells you something about the design of the evaluations. Those evaluations, I noticed some of the ones that Michael meant that I knew about, have tended to concentrate only on one activity. But there's quite a lot of shifting between casual labor and doing your own thing, producing something for your community or your family. Now, if we were sensible human beings, we would regard that as work. But our stupid labor statistics dismiss them and keep them out of count. But if you look at the realities of how people live, they're doing a lot of work that isn't counted as labor. So that's an important aspect of the economic effects. And the final one, which we found, and I didn't really expect it, but we had allowed in the design of the surveys that we conducted, is that collective action takes place inside communities. So that not only have the multiplier effects that you would normally expect with increasing demand, but you induced collective action for cooperatives and certain types of action that produced new goods and services in those communities. And I found that a very exciting aspect.
Okay, thank you. There's a question down here.
Yes, thank you. I don't like at all how that panel is going here. You're treating unconditional basic income as like a new social policy, social insurance, giveaway for the poor, and so on. The idea of unconditional basic income is a much bigger one. It's the question how we want to live together. And if you want to talk about economic impacts, the ETH, the Technical University, has calculated very conservatively, if we keep up the increase in productivity, in 27 years, we will need half as many human labor hours to produce today's GDP. This means that the abundance that this morning was talked about is already here. And we should talk more about how to manage the abundance. There's a mindset in the room now that we are still living in the scarcity, and how should we manage scarcity, and can we scrap a few dollars somewhere to give somebody else? No, in the Western countries, we need to manage the abundance. I'd like to see more of that.
Okay. I think that was more a statement than a question, but welcome nonetheless. And
I'd like to respond to it.
And the lady there as well. Last two questions.
Yes, hello, Rashid Bematuk from University of Zurich. I have a question. We're in the whole discussion, there's always talked about direct effects of this giving money away, but I can imagine a lot of indirect positive externalities with this income. Also, when we're talking about financing this whole thing, like on the state level, if people have time to care for their families or care for the elders, you could need a lot of less money for education and healthcare and such stuff. What other externalities do you see there?
Can I get Amira? Would you like to answer that? I mean, how are people reacting when they have money? Are they taking time off to look after relatives or?
Yeah, they actually do. At least that's what the people that won our basic income do. But a lot of them actually changed their job perspectives. They've been really unhappy just with their situations, working in jobs from 9 to 5, which they hated, not having enough time to spend with family, friends. They all have desires in life, personal projects, hobbies, which they never have time for. Some of them have to cater 5 jobs to have enough money to basically pay for their children's education and food and their hobbies. And a lot of them changed their living situation, got more educated, changed their job situations. So that's basically what happened in our project.
Okay, thank you. And final question to this lady here.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Guy Standing and Michael Faye, actually concerning your field experiments, because it seemed to me that both of you conducted a lot of experiments in not your home countries, but you both referred to Africa, East Africa, India. So I was wondering, how did you choose these communities, or under which programs did you get there? Did you ask them if they wanted to be your guinea pigs? So this is maybe a question of scientific ethics.
Okay, Michael.
Yes, I work in Africa because I work on the extremist of extreme poverty, people living on 65 cents a day as a general kind of average. I think extreme poverty is one of the greatest issues of our time, along with climate change and whatnot. So that was a preference. And I think there are arguments. $1 goes a lot further in these communities than it does in many of the developed countries. In terms of ethics, so there is a long approval process for all of these experiments, involving everything from university IRBs to local governments, to national governments, to the individuals themselves. In everything we've done, we've gone through all of those processes. People voluntarily, they choose to be in the program and receive the cash. And I'm sure it's the exact same with Guy's work. Guy.
Yes, I only had 8 minutes to talk, and I didn't want to go through some of the other issues. Recently, I participated in a British pilot, which has been made into a 4-part TV program, where families in different parts of the country were chosen to receive a basic income, and then every now and then they were revisited and seeing how they were adapting and learning how to use the money. I said in the program that this has a weakness of will problem, because if you give people suddenly a lump sum when they're not used to handling it, that causes potential problems. But I was delighted to see that the experiments actually succeeded in what they set out to do. But I think there are a lot of pilots that are taking place. I'm involved in Ontario, where the initiative has come from a huge number of doctors from hospitals who've got together and are lobbying to have the basic income pilot. But I just want to respond to this point about abundance. I think if you see it from a class perspective, at the moment, there are a hell of a lot of people, not necessarily in Zurich, who are suffering chronic lack of abundance, homelessness, indebtedness that stretches for the rest of their lives. When you talk about abundance, they would mock you back, okay? So we are in a very strange situation where we have to think in terms of potential abundance, yes, but not actual abundance. And we need redistributive mechanisms. And if you're interested in the books, what I'm trying to say is that we need to have a strategy for the great trinity for the 21st century: equality, freedom, and voice, collective voice. And I think that's what the new society has to be about. So basic income can help us move towards a better society where we're in control of our time and we're able to do more things to develop ourselves. That is what the agenda should be about.
All right. Thank you very much to our panelists. I think that was a really fascinating discussion. We are out of time, but thank you.
Thank you.